Rome, 1620. A city known for its art, grandeur, and devout faith held secrets in its shadows that few dared to speak aloud. Amid its cobbled streets and sunlit piazzas, an artist emerged whose talent was unparalleled, yet whose works carried a dark, lethal power. He was known as the condemned painter, a man whose macabre portraits did not merely capture the likeness of his subjects, but seemed to imprison their souls, and in some dreadful, inexplicable way, bring death upon them. Those who commissioned his works often paid handsomely, lured by his fame, unaware of the sinister consequences awaiting them. His studio, tucked away in a narrow alley near the Tiber, was cloaked in darkness even at midday. Candles flickered constantly, their light bouncing against the grim, blood-tinged canvases that lined the walls. The air carried a chill, a faint metallic scent, as if the atmosphere itself had absorbed the horrors of the deaths that followed each portrait. Patrons entered with hope and awe, only to leave trembling, their minds haunted by shadows that clung to the edges of their vision. Every brushstroke seemed deliberate, each line and shadow carefully designed to evoke fear, despair, or obsession in the subject. The painter's own expression remained unreadable, a mask of calm concealing knowledge of the fates that awaited. Stories spread quietly through Rome, whispers of nobles and merchants who purchased his art only to perish mysteriously within weeks or months. Couriers, friends, and servants noted a strange pall over the homes of those who acquired his portraits. Families would awaken one morning to find their loved ones lifeless, faces frozen in expressions of horror, a mirror to the fear captured on the canvas. The painter did not leave obvious clues, nor did he engage in any openly malevolent acts. His work seemed normal, even exquisite, until its deadly effect manifested. Scholars and clergy debated the source of the deaths, some claiming witchcraft, others insisting that it was the devil's work, while skeptics dismissed the notion as coincidence. Yet the pattern could not be ignored. Every owner of his most celebrated works met a tragic end. Roman authorities began investigating quietly, fearful of scandal but determined to understand the phenomenon. Witnesses reported that the painter often spoke of capturing the essence of life and death, cryptic words that chilled all who heard them. Those who saw him at work described the way his eyes gleamed as he traced each line, as if he were drawing not just flesh and features, but the very life force of his subjects. Some of his apprentices were driven to madness, claiming that the canvases whispered at night, calling out the names of the dead. Visitors to the studio sometimes claimed to hear faint cries or see fleeting shadows that disappeared when looked at directly. Every evening, the painter would lock himself in his workspace, the key never leaving his pocket. As he worked in silence by candlelight, hour after hour, crafting his next fatal masterpiece. The city began to speak in hushed tones of the death portraits, as families grew wary and patrons hesitant to engage the artist. Yet fascination persisted. Some rich and curious nobles risked the unknown, eager to possess a piece of his dark genius, blinded by greed and vanity. Rome's art community became divided. Some hailed his technical skill as unrivaled. Others whispered that he had made a pact with forces beyond comprehension. Tales of the dead owners spread like wildfire, transforming the painter into a figure both feared and legendary. Every painting, every commission became a question of life and death, a gamble few were willing to consider, yet many could not resist. The city itself seemed to shiver under his shadow, as though the streets and alleyways knew of the unnatural power wielded by this solitary artist. Patrons reported dreams filled with distorted faces, shadows creeping across their ceilings, and a sense of impending doom that could not be shaken. Merchants feared loss of life and wealth. Some abandoned commissions, while others risked everything for the chance to own a piece of his artistry. The painter remained elusive, never revealing the method or intent behind his work. Some suggested he imbued the portraits with alchemical substances or ancient curses, though no evidence was ever found. Every canvas became a silent witness to his dark mastery, a combination of skill, obsession, and the unexplainable. The boundaries between reality and the supernatural blurred for all who encountered his work. Those who survived, if any, carried lifelong trauma, haunted by images they could not erase from memory. Even centuries later, his paintings are said to retain a sense of menace, a lingering impression of the lives they consumed. Rome in 1620 had never seen a phenomenon so terrifying, where art itself became a vehicle of death, wielded by a single, condemned hand. The painter's story is one of fascination and horror, skill and curse, obsession and tragedy. His legacy, entwined with fear and artistry, serves as a chilling reminder that beauty can mask the most macabre intentions, and that sometimes, the act of creation can hold the power to destroy. The condemned painter remains a figure of legend, a shadow haunting Rome's history, forever remembered for the portraits that claimed their owners. Rome in the early 17th century was a city of contrasts, grandeur and squalor, faith and superstition, beauty and hidden darkness. The streets echoed with the footsteps of merchants, artists, priests, and the common folk, each navigating their lives amid the towering churches and crowded piazzas. In one narrow alley away from the bustling crowds, a studio stood that few dared to approach. This was the workshop of the condemned painter, a man whose reputation oscillated between genius and malevolence. He had trained under the finest masters of the city, mastering techniques of light, shadow, and perspective that allowed him to render flesh and fabric with uncanny realism. Patrons initially sought him for his brilliance, commissioning portraits that captured not only the likeness but also the personality and essence of the sitter. Yet beneath the surface of his skill lay a darkness that would soon claim the lives of those who trusted him. His studio was dimly lit, the walls lined with canvases in various stages of completion. Some were incomplete, their subjects frozen mid-motion, expressions twisted in fear or anguish even before they were fully painted. Others, finished and sold, were said to carry a malignant presence, a supernatural energy that lingered long after the brush left the canvas. The painter himself was a solitary figure, rarely seen outside his studio, moving through Rome like a shadow. Few knew his origins, though rumors suggested he had studied forbidden texts, alchemical manuscripts, and arcane rituals. These whispers, coupled with the mysterious deaths of his patrons, only fueled the growing legend surrounding him. Nobles and wealthy merchants began to talk quietly in drawing rooms and salons, exchanging stories of acquaintances who had vanished after commissioning a portrait. Some claimed that the very act of sitting for the painter caused unease, an unshakable feeling that something malevolent lingered in the room. Servants, too, spoke of faint murmurs, shadows that moved against the candlelight, and a chill that seemed to seep into the bones. Despite these accounts, fascination persisted. Many were drawn to the painter, believing that owning his work conferred status, prestige, or even a glimpse of immortality through art. He was careful to maintain his mystique, rarely speaking, letting the work itself convey power and fear. Occasionally, he would accept an apprentice, often a young artist eager to learn, but few endured his exacting standards. Those who did were sometimes driven to obsession or madness, unable to reconcile the brilliance of the art with the darkness it embodied. The painter's own appearance was unremarkable in many ways, slight of build, nondescript clothing, but his eyes were penetrating, seeming to study not only the sitter but their soul. Patrons reported a sensation of being analyzed, judged, as if the painter could see the very life within them. Even in the street he moved with quiet precision, observing the world with a detached intensity. Outside Rome, word of his work traveled slowly but surely. Travelers brought back tales of the condemned painter, of portraits that were cursed or haunted, and of deaths that defied explanation. Scholars debated whether the deaths were coincidence, divine punishment, or the result of some secret technique known only to the painter. Clergy were particularly concerned, worried that his work was not mere art but a conduit for evil, capable of corrupting souls and drawing the wrath of God. Despite growing unease, commissions continued. Wealth and curiosity outweighed fear, and many sought to possess the forbidden knowledge that seemed embedded in his brushstrokes. Houses that acquired his portraits were never the same again. Rooms that once felt warm and welcoming grew oppressive, filled with shadows that seemed to move independently. Portraits were covered with cloths at night, yet some claimed that even then, the images stared from beneath, waiting, watching. Friends and family of the owners reported changes in behavior, strange illnesses, nightmares, and in the worst cases, sudden, violent deaths. Authorities began to investigate discreetly, yet proof of wrongdoing was elusive. There was no poison, no visible cause, only the chilling correlation between the portraits and the deaths that followed. This growing pattern cemented the painter's reputation as a figure both feared and irresistible, a man whose genius carried the weight of doom. Through all this, he remained enigmatic, never admitting guilt, never explaining his methods, and never revealing the true source of his power. Those who tried to confront him found themselves unsettled, overwhelmed by an inexplicable dread that made communication nearly impossible. The city of Rome, with all its vibrancy and faith, became a stage for this dark drama, the painter at its center. His life and work blurred the line between artistry and malevolence, leaving those who encountered him forever changed. Each commission was a gamble with mortality, a test of courage and folly. Patrons and observers alike struggled to understand how beauty and death could coexist so intimately, how a single hand could wield such power. The painter's studio became a symbol of this uneasy duality, a place where the sublime and the horrifying merged, where a brush could capture life and extinguish it. As the years passed, the condemned painter's fame and infamy spread throughout Rome, reaching the ears of the most influential families. Patrons arrived from distant provinces, curious to witness the remarkable skill of the man whose art seemed to possess a life of its own. Yet alongside the allure of his talent grew an undercurrent of fear. Visitors often described a sense of unease even before stepping inside the studio. The air was thick, almost tangible, with a presence that hinted at something beyond understanding. Candles flickered without wind, and shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the stone walls, creating an atmosphere that was both mesmerizing and suffocating. The painter's methods were meticulous, his obsession with detail bordering on the unnatural. He studied the posture, expression, and eyes of every sitter for hours, sometimes days, sketching tirelessly to capture not just their appearance, but the essence of their being. Friends and family members noticed subtle changes in those who sat for his portraits. Moods darkened, energy waned, and an unshakable anxiety seemed to accompany them home. Rumors circulated that the painter had delved into forbidden alchemy and occult practices, seeking a way to bind life to art itself. While no one could confirm these tales, the pattern of deaths following his commissions was undeniable. Each completed portrait was delivered with an air of solemnity, as if it carried a silent warning. The painter himself offered no explanation, no reassurance, leaving patrons to grapple with the growing dread that accompanied their acquisition. Some attempted to cover or hide the portraits, believing that concealment might break the malignant influence. Others sought counsel from priests or scholars who were equally perplexed, unable to find any tangible cause for the fatalities. Those who questioned the painter directly reported a chilling calm in his voice, a detached serenity that suggested he knew more than he revealed. Apprentices who trained under him often found themselves pushed to extremes, their own mental stability fraying as they tried to comprehend the sinister undercurrent of his work. Some abandoned their studies altogether, driven away by fear or madness, while a rare few endured, learning secrets that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The painter's influence extended beyond the immediate victims of his art. Families, neighbors, and even distant acquaintances felt the ripple effects of his cursed creations. The mere mention of his name could provoke anxiety and speculation. Whispers of the death portraits filled the corridors of palaces and homes alike. Authorities, while aware of the pattern, were hesitant to intervene, fearing scandal and the public's reaction. The deaths appeared natural or unexplained, leaving no legal recourse. The painter's immunity emboldened him, allowing his practices to continue unchecked. Scholars and chroniclers began to document the phenomenon, writing detailed accounts of each victim and the circumstances surrounding their demise. These records would later serve as a grim testament to the painter's uncanny ability to intertwine life and death through art. Even the most skeptical observers were forced to acknowledge the unsettling consistency. Those who commissioned his macabre portraits invariably faced tragic ends. Patrons who survived, if only temporarily, were left scarred, tormented by nightmares and an oppressive sense of being watched. Friends and family reported subtle, almost imperceptible changes in behavior, as if the life force of the sitter had been sapped and transferred into the painting. The painter remained enigmatic throughout, never explaining, justifying, or denying his actions. In public, he appeared courteous, unassuming, and utterly ordinary. Yet the aura of menace that clung to his works revealed the darkness beneath. Over time, Rome became divided in perception. Some viewed him as a genius, a man of unparalleled skill whose portraits captured the very soul of a person. Others saw him as a harbinger of death, a conduit for supernatural or malevolent forces that no human should wield. His name became synonymous with mystery and fear. Even centuries later, historians and art enthusiasts regard the painter with a mixture of admiration and horror, reflecting on the chilling possibility that art itself can harbor lethal power. The condemned painter's legacy persists not only in the few surviving works attributed to him, but also in the stories, legends, and warnings passed down through generations. Each tale reinforces the duality of his existence, a masterful artist whose genius was inseparable from a curse, whose creativity carried the shadow of death. The studio, once a place of creation and beauty, became a symbol of the peril inherent in seeking mastery over life itself. Patrons' greed and desire for prestige had unknowingly made them participants in a deadly game, where their own vanity and fascination with art sealed their fates. By 1620, the painter had established a record that would haunt Rome indefinitely. No other artist had simultaneously inspired awe and terror to such a degree. The pattern was undeniable. The brush in his hand was both a tool of creation and a weapon of death. The story of the condemned painter serves as a grim reminder of how talent can be twisted, how obsession can corrupt, and how the allure of beauty can mask the most macabre and destructive intentions. His portraits are more than images. They are vessels capturing essence, fear, and life itself, demonstrating the terrifying power one individual can wield when skill meets darkness. The city of Rome grew increasingly uneasy as whispers of the condemned painter's deadly talents spread. Patrons and visitors alike shared hushed conversations in candle-lit rooms, recounting stories of friends and acquaintances who had met untimely ends after commissioning portraits. Fear mingled with fascination. While some refused to approach his studio, others were irresistibly drawn to the forbidden promise of immortalized beauty. The painter's skill had reached a level that seemed almost supernatural. Each stroke of the brush was precise, deliberate, and infused with a subtle energy that unsettled the observer. Shadows were rendered with unnerving accuracy, contours of the face capturing expressions of anxiety, sorrow, or secret dread, long before the subject could feel it themselves. Apprentices who watched him work often described a strange hum, almost imperceptible, resonating in the air, a vibration that seemed to interact with the essence of the sitter, subtly altering their spirit even as the painting progressed. Those seated for the portrait would find themselves unable to speak freely, their thoughts seemingly tangled with fear, as if the canvas was drawing more than their likeness, absorbing a part of their very being. Some reported cold sweats, palpitations, or moments of disorientation that intensified over the days following the sitting. Families grew alarmed, but the painter's influence was subtle, almost invisible. The cause of their distress remained a mystery until tragedy struck. Word of these incidents reached Roman authorities, clergy, and scholars, who debated whether the deaths were natural, the result of some obscure poison, or a manifestation of supernatural forces. Despite scrutiny, the painter's methods remained enigmatic, his actions carefully controlled and impeccably precise. Every element in his studio contributed to the growing dread. Walls covered with dark, unfinished canvases, faint scents of oils and dust that carried an almost metallic tang, candles whose flames danced in irregular patterns, and the constant presence of shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Patrons described the feeling of being watched even when alone, as if the studio itself was aware of their fears. Yet fascination persisted. Some wealthy Romans were willing to risk danger to obtain a work by the condemned painter, drawn by a combination of greed, curiosity, and the promise of possessing a piece of unparalleled artistry. Those who survived the process reported lingering unease, an inability to sleep, and vivid nightmares in which the painted faces seemed to whisper or shift in the dark. The painter's reputation for brilliance, coupled with the mysterious deaths, transformed him into a figure both feared and revered. Scholars documented patterns, meticulously noting the sequence of commissions and subsequent deaths, attempting to identify any logical explanation. They examined the canvases for signs of tampering, poison, or hidden mechanisms, yet found nothing tangible. The painter remained an enigma, a man whose genius was inseparable from the deadly aura surrounding his work. Each day he worked tirelessly, perfecting his technique, observing his subjects with penetrating intensity, and ensuring that every portrait would have the desired effect. Neighbors reported that sounds emerged from the studio at odd hours. Whispered words, sudden crashes, or faint cries that could not be traced to any visible source. Patrons hesitated, yet the allure of his work was irresistible. Those who commissioned a painting were often too proud or too curious to turn away, believing that they could withstand the power contained within the brushstrokes. Friends and family urged caution, yet few were able to prevent the tragic outcomes. The painter, always calm and composed, maintained an almost ritualistic process, preparing canvases, mixing pigments, and setting up lighting with meticulous care. Every session was a calculated performance, each brushstroke measured, each shadow precisely placed. Apprentices who witnessed these procedures often felt a creeping sense of dread, recognizing that the work was far more than simple artistry. Over time, patterns emerged. The most prominent patrons, those who sought to immortalize themselves or assert social status through his work, were often the first to fall victim. The painter's method appeared indiscriminate, yet selectively targeted those whose presence in the portrait invoked the strongest effect. Scholars began speculating that some combination of alchemical knowledge, psychological manipulation, and artistic mastery allowed the painter to impose a supernatural influence on his subjects. The city's elite remained intrigued, often choosing to dismiss the rumors as exaggeration, unwilling to believe that an artist could wield such power over life and death. Yet the evidence accumulated too consistently to ignore. Patrons and witnesses alike described subtle anomalies, shadows that moved against the light, reflections in mirrors that did not correspond to reality, and a pervasive sense that the paintings themselves were alive. Rumors of the painter's consultations with occult practitioners or secretive societies circulated in hushed tones, adding layers of mystique to his already formidable reputation. The combination of fear, awe, and fascination created a perfect storm, ensuring that the painter's influence extended far beyond the walls of his studio. Every new commission was a potential tragedy, a calculated blend of beauty and death. As Rome's whispers grew louder, the condemned painter's notoriety spread beyond the city's borders. Travelers, merchants, and nobles carried tales of death following each commission, often embellishing details with fear and imagination. Yet the painter himself remained an enigma, appearing indifferent to the mounting stories of tragedy. Inside his studio, the air was thick with the scent of oil, varnish, and something indefinably metallic, as if the walls themselves absorbed the essence of the doomed patrons. The painter's methods became increasingly precise and deliberate. Every brushstroke seemed calculated not merely to capture likeness, but to manipulate the very essence of life. Apprentices who dared to witness him in action reported feelings of dizziness, nausea, and an almost hypnotic compulsion to obey his instructions, as though the studio exerted its own sentient will. Patrons entering the studio would sometimes hesitate, their curiosity clashing with a primal fear that warned them to flee. Yet few resisted the temptation, lured by vanity, greed, or fascination with the extraordinary skill before them. Families and friends grew wary, often attempting to dissuade their loved ones from sitting for a portrait, but the painter's reputation held a magnetic force that was difficult to resist. Those who commissioned his work would frequently describe an unexplainable sensation during the sitting, a subtle pressure on the chest, a chill that crept along the spine, and the feeling that the brush was penetrating beyond flesh and into the soul. Patrons later reported vivid dreams of their own painted likenesses, twisted in agony or despair, foretelling the fate that awaited them. Scholars attempted to study the painter's technique, hoping to uncover the source of the deaths. They scrutinized pigments, canvases, and lighting arrangements, yet found nothing that could account for the uncanny phenomena. The painter remained a master of secrecy, providing only the final stunning portrait without explanation. Rumors flourished that he had discovered a way to transfer life force or essence into the canvas itself, perhaps through a combination of alchemical knowledge and psychological manipulation. These rumors were never confirmed, but they added to the chilling aura surrounding him. Patrons who survived longer than expected often grew paranoid, obsessively monitoring their portraits for signs of movement or change, fearing that the painting itself had become an agent of death. Observers reported subtle changes in the portraits over time, eyes that seemed to follow the viewer, expressions that shifted in the dim light, or shadows that deepened unnaturally. Families recounted tales of servants who refused to enter rooms where the paintings hung, claiming that the air felt heavy and unnatural. In public, the painter's demeanor was unremarkable, calm and courteous, yet the aura of dread around his work could not be ignored. Even casual acquaintances felt unease when discussing him, as though the mere mention of his name invited misfortune. As the body count grew, so did the intrigue. Patrons sought explanations in superstition, alchemy, and even divine retribution, but none could fully account for the painter's macabre effect. The city's elite remained both fascinated and horrified, understanding that his works represented a power beyond comprehension. Apprentices and assistants often struggled to separate technical skill from the malevolent influence embedded in each brushstroke. Some succumbed to madness, unable to endure the studio's oppressive atmosphere, while a select few survived to carry stories of the painter's dark genius into history. The painter's art had become a form of psychological manipulation, each detail meticulously planned to evoke a reaction that would linger and intensify after leaving the studio. Patrons frequently reported physical discomfort, a sense of foreboding and a creeping anxiety that only intensified over time. Even after the paintings were hung in homes, a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the environment was noticed. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, air felt colder, and the occupants themselves seemed drained. The condemned painter's reputation had transformed him into a symbol of Rome's darkest fears, a reminder that beauty could be lethal, that genius could conceal malevolence, and that curiosity often came at a mortal cost. The combination of technical mastery, psychological insight, and mysterious influence ensured that his work remained both coveted and feared. As new patrons approached, the city waited in suspense, wondering who would next fall victim to the painter's deadly creations. Every completed portrait became both an object of admiration and a harbinger of doom, a duality that fascinated and terrified in equal measure. The city of Rome, vibrant and alive, had unwittingly become a stage for an ongoing drama in which art, death, and human desire collided in tragic and horrifying ways. The year 1620 marked a turning point in the life of the condemned painter. His reputation had reached its peak, drawing patrons from the wealthiest families in Rome, each eager to possess a portrait that captured more than mere likeness. Yet the painter's obsession had grown darker, more focused, and more lethal. The energy in his studio intensified, thickening the air and amplifying the sense of dread that visitors experienced upon entering. Every detail was scrutinized, every movement calculated. As the brush moved across the canvas, the sitter became increasingly uneasy, unable to pinpoint the source of their discomfort. Shadows seemed to gather unnaturally around the painter, and the flickering candlelight cast shapes that twisted and warped, as if mocking the living subjects. In one notable case, a prominent Roman noble commissioned a grand portrait, hoping to immortalize his wealth and status. He spent hours sitting silently, observing the painter's meticulous movements while feeling an inexplicable pressure in the room. The painter's eyes, focused and intense, never wavered. Every stroke of the brush seemed to drain vitality, leaving the sitter pale, fatigued, and disturbed. Days after receiving the completed portrait, the noble fell gravely ill. Physicians were baffled. No disease, no injury could explain the rapid decline. The family, terrified, suspected a supernatural cause. Soon, news spread that the noble had died under mysterious circumstances, his death eerily linked to the portrait. This was not an isolated incident. Patrons who had commissioned portraits around the same period experienced similar fates, each death seemingly tied to the precise execution of the painter's craft. Rumors multiplied. The painter was no ordinary artist, but a man who had harnessed forces beyond human understanding. Some whispered of pacts with dark entities, others of forbidden alchemical techniques that could bind life to canvas. Yet no concrete evidence existed. The painter continued his work undeterred, moving with the calm of a master fully aware of his power. Observers described the scenes in his studio as surreal, almost hypnotic. Brushes danced across the canvas with the rhythm of a ritual, and the sound of the strokes seemed to echo unnaturally in the room, reverberating against the walls and floors. Apprentices who tried to assist often found themselves paralyzed by fear, unable to continue without becoming ill or fainting. The painter's focus was absolute. Nothing could disturb the meticulous progression of his work. In another case, a merchant commissioned a portrait for a wealthy relative. The painter spent days studying his subject, noting every expression, gesture, and micro-reaction. The resulting portrait was stunning, a masterpiece of technical brilliance and haunting realism. Yet the sitter soon fell into a state of delirium, haunted by visions of his own painted face twisting in agony. Friends and family claimed that the portrait itself seemed to shift, with eyes following them across the room, a constant reminder of impending doom. The painter, meanwhile, remained aloof, unaffected by the chaos his work inspired. His actions were deliberate, controlled, and seemingly devoid of remorse. Scholars, clergy, and authorities debated the implications. Could a human being truly manipulate life through art? Was the painter a conduit for supernatural power, or had he discovered a technique lost to time? Investigations yielded nothing tangible, only mounting fear and speculation. Stories proliferated among the citizens. A painter whose brush could claim life, a studio where shadows moved with intention, and canvases that whispered in the dead of night. Even ordinary people spoke of unease, describing fleeting glimpses of faces in empty windows or cold drafts that seemed to emanate from the paintings themselves. Patrons, driven by vanity and curiosity, continued to seek the painter despite the obvious peril. The city of Rome became caught in a tension between admiration for genius and fear of mortality. In private homes, servants reported that the portraits caused sleepless nights, paranoia, and anxiety, with some refusing to remain in the room for long. Families divided between pride in owning such artistry and terror at its effects. The painter's reputation reached such heights that he became a figure of legend while still alive. Rumors suggested he could extract life essence during the painting process, but no method was ever confirmed. Yet the consistent pattern of death among patrons lent credibility to even the wildest claims. His art was now more than a medium. It was a weapon, a tool of silent, relentless power. Patrons learned too late that their desire for prestige and recognition could be fatal. The condemned painter's mastery of technique, coupled with the mysterious aura surrounding him, created a climate of fear and fascination that pervaded Rome. Each new portrait heightened suspense. Each commission carried risk, and each death reinforced the chilling reputation of the artist. By 1620, the city had recognized an undeniable truth. The condemned painter's works were not merely art, but instruments of death, wielded with precision and intent. The painter's influence reached its peak during this period, as the city's elite became simultaneously obsessed and terrified. Patrons who once believed themselves immune to rumors began to notice subtle signs that something was deeply wrong. Shadows in the corners of rooms seemed alive, and reflections in mirrors appeared distorted, often showing expressions that the living did not wear. The painter's brush continued its silent work, tracing lines and colors with precision, each stroke a calculated measure of subtle malevolence. One noblewoman, eager to preserve her youthful beauty and assert her status, commissioned a grand portrait. She spent long hours in the studio, feeling an inexplicable weight pressing upon her chest, an invisible presence that seemed to lean in closer as the painter worked. Her expressions became tense, her posture stiff, and her heart raced without explanation. Days later, her health deteriorated rapidly. Physicians could find no cause, yet she died quietly in her home, her final moments eerily reflecting the expressions captured in the painting. News of her death spread quickly, reinforcing the terrifying reputation of the condemned painter. Patrons who remained alive grew increasingly paranoid, examining every shadow, every flicker of candlelight, and every glance from the painting itself. Scholars attempted to catalog his works, studying patterns, pigment combinations, and compositional techniques. They noted that certain features were consistently emphasized. Eyes widened unnaturally, expressions frozen in a mixture of fear and resignation, and shadowed contours that seemed to extend beyond the canvas. It was as though the painter had discovered a method to manipulate not just the perception of the viewer, but their very essence. Rumors circulated that he had mastered forbidden knowledge, combining alchemical experiments with psychological manipulation to create an invisible thread connecting subject and portrait. Authorities tried to intervene, but evidence was impossible to obtain. The death seemed coincidental to outsiders, but the repeated pattern left little doubt among those who had observed closely. The painter's own demeanor remained calm and unassuming, even as chaos followed his work. Apprentices struggled to comprehend the full scope of his mastery. witnessing moments that defied understanding. A brush moving seemingly of its own volition, canvases that appeared to pulse and shadows that clung to the sitter like living entities. Patrons' homes became places of quiet terror. Friends and family reported strange phenomena, whispers in empty rooms, paintings that seemed to shift in subtle ways, and the sensation that the subjects of the portraits were no longer confined to canvas. The painter's genius, combined with an unexplainable, almost supernatural presence, created a lethal blend of fascination and dread. Rome society, once enamored with beauty and talent, found itself negotiating fear and admiration. Those who commissioned works were caught between the desire for status and the terror of the unknown. Some attempted to destroy or hide the paintings, but stories persisted that the malevolent influence could not be fully contained. Observers reported that even destroyed canvases left a lingering sense of unease, suggesting that the painter's power extended beyond the material form. Patrons and victims alike became cautionary tales, their fates reinforcing the mystique of the condemned painter. As the number of victims grew, the painter's legend solidified. Historians, chroniclers, and artists debated endlessly about the nature of his influence, unable to reconcile his technical brilliance with the lethal consequences of his work. The city itself seemed to acknowledge his power. Merchants whispered in fear. Servants avoided rooms, and even those who had never seen his studio felt a shiver when his name was mentioned. The condemned painter had become a force beyond comprehension, a figure whose genius could not be separated from the horror it invoked. In these years, Rome became a city living under the shadow of the painter's deadly art. Every new commission a potential tragedy, and every completed portrait a silent witness to the human cost of beauty and ambition. His ability to capture not just appearance but the life force of his subjects, combined with the mysterious deaths that followed, transformed his work into a weapon, an instrument of fate wielded with unrivaled precision. Patrons, scholars, and families were caught in the tension between awe and fear, each new story further entwining the painter's name with death, obsession, and legend. The climax of his career, marked by these simultaneous acts of creation and destruction, revealed the terrifying reality. Genius and malice can coexist, and art in the hands of the condemned painter was indistinguishable from doom. The deaths and disappearances of patrons left Rome in a state of quiet panic. Families mourned, whispers filled the streets, and the legend of the condemned painter grew darker with each passing day. Nobles who once sought his skill now avoided his studio, fearful that their vanity might summon doom. Scholars and clergy debated the moral implications of his work, questioning how art, an instrument of beauty, could inflict death. Yet no one dared confront him directly. The painter remained elusive, continuing his work with the same calm, meticulous precision. Survivors of his sittings described lingering effects, insomnia, hallucinations, and a persistent sense of being watched. Houses that had received his portraits became places of unease. Servants refused to enter rooms, and family members reported sudden cold drafts and shadows moving without explanation. Stories circulated of patrons whose health declined mysteriously, often dying in ways that mirrored expressions in their portraits. Despite these tragedies, the painter's art was still sought after, a paradox that drew both fascination and horror. Patrons were torn between the desire to possess such genius and the instinct to flee, creating an air of tension and obsession. Over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Rome itself seemed to recognize the danger. Officials carefully avoided interference while rumors of supernatural involvement spread unchecked. Priests offered prayers and blessings, hoping to counteract the malevolent effects of the portraits, but with little success. Chroniclers began documenting cases systematically, noting that death followed each commission with unnerving consistency. Families who had lost loved ones to the painter's work were left in despair, struggling to comprehend the randomness and inevitability of the events. Some attempted to destroy the paintings, covering canvases with cloths, burning them or locking them away, yet the sense of dread persisted, as though the painter's influence transcended the physical medium. Scholars speculated on his techniques, suggesting a combination of psychological manipulation, arcane knowledge, and an understanding of human fear that made his work lethal. The painter himself became an object of study, his life, habits, and methods dissected by those seeking answers. Few succeeded in observing him without succumbing to unease, and no comprehensive understanding was ever achieved. In homes that possessed his work, The atmosphere changed irrevocably. Rooms that once felt warm and inviting became cold. Oppressive spaces where shadows seemed alive and eyes in the paintings appeared to follow occupants. Servants reported hearing faint whispers or footsteps when no one was present, and occupants often experienced vivid dreams in which the painted subjects moved or spoke. These ongoing phenomena reinforced the painter's legend, ensuring that his reputation remained both feared and revered. The pattern of death created a climate of paranoia, as those who survived feared the latent effects of even viewing his work. Attempts to study or counteract the influence often failed, leaving only anecdotal evidence of the painter's extraordinary and lethal skill. The city's elite recognized the need for caution, yet curiosity and vanity continued to drive commissions. Some believed possessing a painting might confer status, immortality, or insight, unaware of the hidden cost. The painter's meticulous control of his craft allowed him to maintain authority over life and death, manipulating perception and essence with a precision that defied understanding. Over time, families and patrons recorded the tragic events meticulously, creating chronicles of horror that would inform future generations. Each new death reinforced the notion that the painter's genius was inseparable from malevolence. Attempts to isolate, restrain, or punish him were futile. The city had no authority over the subtle and mysterious powers embedded in his art. His work became both a warning and a fascination, a stark example of how beauty could mask lethal intent, and how human desire for admiration and status could become a fatal weakness. Chroniclers emphasized that his portraits were more than mere images. They were vessels that captured essence, manipulated perception, and imposed fatal consequences. Rome's society, already rife with superstition and fear, absorbed these lessons with a mixture of awe and terror. Patrons and citizens alike grew cautious, aware that their curiosity could bring misfortune. Yet the allure of genius persisted, demonstrating the irresistible power of mastery even when intertwined with doom. Scholars and clergy sought to understand, yet no clear explanation could reconcile the painter's technical brilliance with the deadly outcomes. The aftermath of his work extended beyond immediate victims, influencing culture, superstition, and the collective memory of the city. Rome itself, vibrant and proud, carried the shadows of the condemned painter's creations. Families avoided discussion, servants whispered, and fear became woven into the social fabric. Patrons who survived attempted to distance themselves, yet a lingering dread remained. The painter's legacy was cemented not just through skill, but through the inescapable terror his portraits inspired, creating an enduring narrative of beauty entwined with death, fascination interlaced with horror. Each completed work, each tragic death, each whispered tale contributed to a pattern that would haunt Rome for decades. The painter's genius had transcended mortality, embedding itself in history as a cautionary tale about obsession, vanity, and the hidden power that artistry could wield when merged with malevolence. The city of Rome struggled to reconcile its admiration for artistic genius with the terrifying legacy of the condemned painter. Patrons who survived his sittings carried psychological scars, haunted by visions of their own painted likenesses, which seemed to twist and breathe with unseen life. Families lived in constant vigilance, monitoring the slightest changes in expression or movement in the portraits hanging in their homes. The painter's influence extended far beyond the physical space of his studio. The aura of dread followed the canvases, lingering even when removed or concealed. Servants reported chilling whispers at night, doors creaking open without cause, and shadows that seemed to detach from the walls. Some attempted to cleanse the rooms with prayers, rituals, or holy water, yet the oppressive feeling persisted, suggesting that the painter's control was not purely physical, but rooted in some deeper arcane force. The deaths and misfortunes of patrons became a topic of fear and fascination throughout Rome, cementing the painter's name in history as a figure of dark genius. Scholars and chroniclers meticulously documented each case, noting the eerie correlation between the completion of a portrait and the subsequent tragedies. Debates raged about the nature of his power. Was it purely psychological, a manipulation of the human mind? Or did the painter indeed wield a supernatural influence, transferring essence or life into the canvas itself? No concrete evidence could satisfy the inquiries, leaving the city in a perpetual state of suspense and speculation. Patrons who dared to seek his work were often consumed by obsession. They viewed their portraits with both pride and horror, captivated by the extraordinary skill yet terrified by the subtle, almost imperceptible malice embedded within. The painter's apprentices, few who survived, recounted chilling tales of the meticulous and calculated methods he employed, describing how each stroke was infused with intention, each shadow strategically placed to manipulate perception and elicit fear. Even the most skeptical observers found themselves uneasy, unable to explain the consistency of the tragedies that followed. The condemned painter's work transcended the boundaries of art. It became a psychological and spiritual weapon, wielded with precision and an unnerving calm. Families who had once celebrated the beauty of his portraits became cautious, wary of the unseen forces lurking within the brushstrokes. Patrons attempted to remove or hide the paintings, but many reported lingering effects as though the essence captured in the portraits could not be contained. Scholars debated endlessly, examining pigments, lighting, and composition, seeking clues to the painter's method. Some hypothesized that his understanding of human fear, combined with technical skill and ritualistic preparation, allowed him to influence life itself. Authorities, aware of the pattern of deaths but unable to intervene, remained passive observers, wary of scandal and powerless against an invisible force. Rome's society became split between admiration for artistic genius and dread of its consequences. The condemned painter became a symbol of both talent and terror, demonstrating the fine line between brilliance and malevolence. Patrons' pride and curiosity often overrode caution, yet they could not escape the subtle influence of the portraits. Servants, family members, and observers alike reported a growing sense of oppression, a heavy weight that seemed to emanate from the painted images themselves. The city's streets echoed with whispers of fear and fascination, reinforcing the legend. As decades passed, the painter's works continued to circulate, often inherited, relocated, or sold, carrying with them the lingering aura of doom. Each new owner unknowingly became part of the ongoing narrative, a participant in the silent, persistent influence of the condemned artist. Chroniclers noted that even when the physical paintings were lost, memories and descriptions of them invoked a subtle fear, suggesting that the painter's reputation alone could affect perception and psychological state. Rome's history recorded his deeds as both marvel and warning, a testament to the potential for genius to intertwine with darkness, and for beauty to conceal lethality. Families attempted to purge his influence through destruction, concealment, or spiritual intervention, but few succeeded. The aftermath of his career persisted, affecting generations, leaving a legacy of dread intertwined with admiration. Even centuries later, scholars, artists, and historians referenced his work as a chilling example of the power of art over human perception, and the fragility of life in the hands of a master whose skill was inseparable from malevolence. The condemned painter's name became synonymous with caution, a reminder that curiosity and ambition carry unseen consequences, and that genius, when coupled with dark intent, can leave indelible marks on both history and human psyche. Rome itself, once vibrant and proud, bore the subtle scars of the painter's influence, the shadows of his work lingering in memory, architecture, and culture. Patrons and families understood that survival did not guarantee safety. The painter's legacy, intertwined with both horror and fascination, endured. The city, its scholars, clergy, and citizens were bound together by a collective acknowledgement of the dangerous allure of beauty, ambition, and the mysterious power of the condemned artist. Despite the passage of time, the condemned painter's works continued to evoke fear, curiosity, and speculation throughout Rome. Historians, scholars, and clergy debated the origin of his power, questioning whether it was a product of genius, malevolence, or the supernatural. Some argued that the painter had discovered hidden alchemical formulas, enabling him to capture essence or life within the canvas itself. Others believed that the works were cursed, imbued with a malevolent force that transcended mortal understanding. Attempts to replicate his technique were futile. Apprentices and artists who tried to imitate his brushwork reported feelings of unease, dizziness, or subtle psychological disturbances. Patrons who inherited his portraits often described inexplicable events: sudden illness, chilling whispers, distorted reflections, and shadows that moved independently of any source. Stories persisted of the painted subject's shifting expression when unobserved, as if the portraits were alive and aware. Investigations by clergy and scholars yielded no tangible evidence. The pigments, brushes, and methods appeared conventional, Yet the outcome defied explanation. The consistency of deaths and misfortunes surrounding the paintings could not be attributed to coincidence. Chroniclers meticulously documented each case, compiling records that described patterns, timings, and effects. Families recounted detailed accounts of how the influence of the paintings persisted long after the sitter's death. Some claimed that the painter had understood human psychology to an unparalleled degree, manipulating fear, anticipation, and perception to create outcomes that seemed supernatural. Others suggested that darker forces, demonic or arcane, had been harnessed during the creation of the portraits, imbuing each with a fragment of life and death. Attempts to cleanse homes or neutralize the portraits failed, reinforcing the belief in their cursed nature. Patrons often tried to destroy the paintings, but misfortune seemed to follow, leaving subtle reminders of the painter's enduring power. Scholars debated whether the painter's genius alone could account for the effects or if unseen forces were at play. In some instances, the paintings were transferred to other locations, yet the aura of dread persisted, as if the influence had become independent of physical placement. Stories of hauntings, shifting expressions, and inexplicable maladies circulated through the city, ensuring that the painter's legacy remained alive in both memory and fear. Even those who had never seen his works felt unease at the mention of his name. Superstitions grew, and the painter's life and methods became intertwined with the folklore of Rome. Generations of citizens recalled tales of the death portraits, passing them down as cautionary stories. Scholars attempted to reconstruct the painter's technique, hoping to discover rational explanations, yet no method could replicate the lethal effect. Psychologists, clergy, and historians speculated endlessly, producing theories that ranged from advanced manipulation of human perception to supernatural interference. The painter's methods were meticulously documented by a few brave chroniclers, revealing his focus on expression, shadow, posture, and atmosphere. Yet the exact combination that resulted in death remained elusive. Patrons continued to fear the possession of these works, yet curiosity and ambition often overcame caution. The painter's art had transcended mortality, leaving a legacy that challenged the limits of understanding. Families who survived the tragedies carried the psychological burden of the painter's influence, recounting tales of cold drafts, unexplained shadows, and whispers that seemed to emanate from the paintings themselves. Even when canvases were destroyed, a residual fear remained, as if the memory of the painter's malevolence could not be erased. Scholars noted that the impact of his work extended beyond physical harm. It altered perception, induced dread, and imposed subtle psychological pressure that persisted across time and space. The painter's true methods, intentions, and the source of his influence remained unsolved, a mystery that would haunt Rome for generations. The cumulative effect of these events established the painter as both genius and terror, an enigma whose works challenged the boundary between life, death, and the perception of reality. Patrons, families, and citizens understood that his influence was not easily contained, and that the power of his portraits extended far beyond the visual. The death portraits became symbols of human ambition, fear, and the potential consequences of engaging with forces beyond understanding. Even centuries later, art historians and scholars study his works, questioning whether the effects were psychological, supernatural, or a combination of both. The mystery endures, a painter whose art killed, haunted, and manipulated reality, leaving behind an unresolved legacy of terror and fascination. The condemned painter's enigma continued to grip Rome even decades after his death. Patrons' families whispered of residual effects, tales of unease passed down through generations. Scholars attempted to uncover rational explanations, yet the phenomena resisted logic. Canvases that had long been hidden or relocated still carried a sense of presence, a subtle pressure that could be felt in the air. Some who encountered the portraits experienced a deep, creeping dread that defied reason, as though the essence of the painter's craft had become independent of the sitter. Researchers debated whether the painter had truly discovered a method to imbue life or death into his work, or whether human fear had amplified the legend into a self-fulfilling reality. Chroniclers compiled evidence meticulously, documenting patterns, noting dates of sittings, subsequent deaths, and lingering psychological effects. Even the most skeptical observers found themselves unsettled, acknowledging that something beyond ordinary comprehension had occurred. Families recounted servants refusing to enter rooms containing his works, sudden illnesses striking relatives, and whispers that seemed to emanate from the paintings themselves. Clergy offered prayers, scholars studied pigments, and historians theorized endlessly, yet the truth remained elusive. The painter's legacy became a cautionary tale, beauty intertwined with malevolence, genius shadowed by horror. Patrons and their descendants remained wary, haunted not just by memory but by the subtle, lingering influence of his craft. Attempts to neutralize or destroy the works often led to further misfortune, reinforcing the belief in a supernatural element. Stories circulated across Rome and beyond, describing shadows that moved independently, reflections that did not match reality, and expressions in the paintings that seemed to shift when unobserved. The painter's influence was not limited to those who sat for his portraits. The mere presence of his works instilled fear and fascination alike. Scholars debated psychological explanations, suggesting a combination of human expectation, suggestion, and superstition might account for some phenomena. Yet the consistency of death and misfortune could not be ignored. Patrons' lives unraveled, families mourned, and communities whispered about the cursed legacy. Even those who had never directly encountered the painter felt trepidation at hearing his name. The painter's method remained an unsolved puzzle. Was it the subtle manipulation of perception, a mastery of psychology, or forces beyond human understanding? The exact source of his power remained hidden, a dark secret lost to time. Chroniclers emphasized the psychological burden placed upon families who lived in constant vigilance, monitoring every shadow and reflection. The painter's genius had created not only lethal works of art, but a pervasive, enduring atmosphere of dread. Historians noted that the legend persisted because the effects were both tangible and intangible. Physical illness, psychological torment, and social fear combined to ensure the painter's influence endured. Patrons attempted to avoid his works, yet curiosity and ambition often led them back, demonstrating the irresistible pull of genius mingled with terror. The painter's legacy was ultimately a study of human desire, fear, and the unforeseen consequences of engaging with forces beyond understanding. Even centuries later, modern scholars and art historians continue to debate the boundaries between genius, superstition, and malevolence. The paintings, lost or preserved, serve as a reminder that the power of art can transcend mere appearance, influencing perception, emotion, and perhaps life itself. Rome, its culture, and its history became indelibly marked by the condemned painter, whose works haunted both spaces and minds. Patrons and families alike carried the psychological weight of the painter's craft, while scholars continued to speculate, ensuring that the mystery remained alive in memory and legend. The cumulative evidence, anecdotal accounts, and persistent reports of supernatural or unexplained phenomena solidify the painter's status as an enduring enigma, a master whose genius was inseparable from danger, whose work challenged reality itself. The mystery of the condemned painter remains unresolved, a testament to the enduring intersection of brilliance and malevolence, of art and death, and of human fascination with the unknown. The condemned painter's life and work left an indelible mark on Rome, shaping both the city's history and its collective consciousness. Families who had suffered through the tragedies of his portraits carried the weight of memory, each telling cautionary tales about beauty intertwined with death. Servants, scholars, and clergy recounted stories of shadows, whispers, and chilling presences that lingered long after the painter's death. His works were no longer simply art. They had become objects of fear, fascination, and legend. Patrons who survived the lethal influence of his paintings lived with the constant tension between pride and dread, understanding that the beauty captured in oil and canvas masked a malevolent force. Historians documented his life meticulously, noting patterns, events, and consequences, but the essence of his power remained elusive. Scholars debated endlessly. Was it a mastery of human psychology, an occult method, or an inexplicable supernatural force? No conclusion could satisfy the depth of mystery surrounding him. The painter's influence extended beyond individuals, shaping culture, superstition, and social behavior in Rome. Families displayed his works with caution, often covering canvases when visitors arrived or placing them in hidden rooms. Yet the fear persisted. Patrons' descendants recounted tales of unexplained drafts, shifting shadows and portraits that seemed to move subtly when unobserved. Even when the paintings were destroyed, the psychological burden endured. The city's collective memory was marked by the painter's dark genius, a legend that intertwined ambition, curiosity, and fear. Visitors to Rome heard whispers about the painter, understanding that his genius came at a cost, and that the allure of his work carried consequences beyond comprehension. The painter's technique, though meticulously studied, could not be replicated. Apprentices who attempted to learn under him often succumbed to illness, madness, or despair. His mastery of composition, expression, and shadow was unmatched. Yet it was the unseen element, the subtle manipulation of perception and essence, that rendered his work deadly. Patrons' lives were altered irrevocably, haunted by visions, dreams, and subtle changes in the portraits themselves. Families lived in vigilance, their homes permeated by an oppressive, unexplainable presence. Chroniclers documented each tragedy, ensuring that future generations would understand the peril embedded in the painter's genius. The painter's legacy became a cautionary tale, warning of the consequences of ambition, curiosity, and engagement with forces beyond comprehension. His life demonstrated that artistic skill could be inseparable from danger, that beauty could conceal malevolence, and that human fascination often comes at a cost. Even centuries later, the painter's name invoked awe and terror. His work studied not only for artistic merit but for the psychological and supernatural impact they had inflicted. The painter's life, his tragedies, and the ongoing influence of his works established a narrative of genius intertwined with horror, a reminder that human desire for immortality, recognition, and prestige could attract unforeseen consequences. Families, scholars, and historians acknowledged the enduring significance of his work. That mastery, when coupled with malevolence, leaves a lasting imprint. Patrons' lives, once filled with hope and ambition, were transformed into cautionary tales, illustrating the precarious balance between admiration and fear. The painter's influence shaped the architecture of social interaction, the understanding of art, and the perception of reality itself. His works, feared and revered, remained objects of fascination, their lethal history ensuring that curiosity was tempered by caution. The city of Rome, vibrant yet haunted, carried the memory of his deeds in every whispered story, every carefully placed canvas, and every shadowed corner of the city. Scholars analyzed, clergy prayed, and citizens remained wary, yet the painter's genius persisted in cultural memory. His legacy demonstrated the inescapable intertwining of human skill, ambition, and the unknowable forces that can arise when mastery is coupled with intent. The condemned painter's life and work serve as an enduring reminder that beauty, genius, and ambition, when shadowed by malevolence, can leave consequences that persist across centuries, altering perception, haunting memory, and shaping history in ways both subtle and profound. The final chapter of the condemned painter's story reinforced the permanence of his influence. Even long after his death, families and patrons lived with the consequences of his works. Portraits that survived continued to instill unease, their presence a reminder of the lethal genius that had once thrived in Rome. Servants refused to enter rooms, visitors felt an inexplicable tension, and whispers of the painter's deeds echoed through generations. Historians, scholars, and clergy all attempted to analyze his techniques, yet no definitive explanation emerged. The combination of meticulous skill, deep understanding of human psychology, and the persistent aura of malevolence created an enigma beyond comprehension. Patrons who survived his sittings remained cautious, passing down tales of dread and subtle manipulation. Families recounted incidents of shadows moving unnaturally, portraits seemingly shifting expression, and an oppressive atmosphere that could not be removed, even with prayers or rituals. The condemned painter's legacy was firmly established in both memory and culture, a cautionary example of ambition, obsession, and the hidden power of art. Scholars argued over the mechanisms, considering alchemical formulas, psychological mastery, or supernatural intervention. Yet consensus remained impossible. Each surviving painting carried with it a silent, unyielding weight, influencing perception, instilling fear, and perpetuating the legend. Rome itself bore the mark of his work, the city's architecture, cultural memory, and societal behavior, reflecting the pervasive influence of a genius entwined with horror. Patrons, descendants, and the general populace understood that the painter's creations were not merely aesthetic objects, but vessels of profound and sometimes lethal effect. The aftermath of his life extended through centuries, shaping how art, fear, and human perception intersected. Chroniclers meticulously documented cases of death, misfortune, and persistent unease, ensuring that future generations recognized both the brilliance and peril of his work. Families approached the surviving paintings with reverence and caution, acknowledging that curiosity or vanity could provoke unforeseen consequences. Scholars continued to study his methods, sometimes attempting replication, only to encounter failure, illness, or madness. The painter's genius, inseparable from malevolence, became a defining aspect of Rome's cultural narrative. Even without direct exposure, the name of the condemned painter inspired fear, fascination, and endless speculation. Patrons' homes became spaces of tension, with each painting a silent witness, a subtle manipulator, and a reminder of mortality. Religious authorities offered prayers and performed rituals, hoping to mitigate the lingering influence. Yet the stories of unease persisted. Generations grew up aware of the painter's history, his works a constant lesson on the dangers of desire, pride, and engagement with forces beyond understanding. Artists, scholars, and historians studied his compositions, marveling at the technical brilliance while remaining wary of the hidden malevolence that accompanied each stroke. The condemned painter's name became synonymous with caution, genius, and terror, his influence extending into art theory, psychology, and folklore. Patrons understood that the line between admiration and obsession could be fatal, and that the allure of mastery often concealed dangers invisible to the eye. The painter's legacy served as a reminder that human skill, when entwined with dark intent, can have repercussions beyond the immediate and tangible. Each surviving work became a silent narrative, a repository of fear, brilliance, and unresolved mystery. Even centuries later, the painter's influence remained palpable, his legend a warning to those who sought power, recognition, or immortality through art. The condemned painter had transformed beauty into a vehicle of malevolence, genius into terror, and perception into both fascination and dread. Rome, its citizens, scholars, and patrons remained bound by the collective memory of his deeds, aware that the influence of a master could extend beyond mortality itself. The condemned painter's story concluded not with his death, but with the enduring effect of his works, a haunting reminder that art, genius, and darkness can coexist, shaping history, perception, and the human experience in ways both profound and terrifying. His legacy persists as an enduring lesson that ambition, curiosity, and admiration, when shadowed by malevolent skill, can leave consequences echoing across centuries, in both the tangible and the unseen.